Madam President, for recognizing me to join in this debate on the 2018 budget. At the outset, let me state I'm grateful to the political leader of the United National Congress, Mrs. Kamala Prasad Bisesa, for giving me this rare privilege via this appointment to the Senate to make a contribution in this honorable chamber on the 2018 budget debate. I would like to congratulate Mrs. Prasad Bisesa on her budget response in the other place. She condemned the 2018 budget as an act of terror against all citizens, one that traumatized the country and betrayed the trust of the people. I must also congratulate the leader of opposition business in the Senate, Senator Mark, and my other UNC Senate colleagues for their well-researched and excellent contributions to this 2018 budget debate. They all pointed to the growing inability of the Rowley-led PNM government to present new ideas to fix the problems facing our country. Madam President, quite frankly, I too found the 2018 budget to be uninspiring, underachieving, and it left me unimpressed. As an economist and citizen, I am disturbed to see the direction in which our country is heading under this PNM government and where we could be within the next 3 years. As an economist who started working at the central bank more than 25 years ago and went on to become its governor some 5 years ago, my journey as an economist has actually paralleled our country's economic journey. From one of our lowest points at the end of the 80s to now, I have seen the growth of our precious foreign exchange reserves from $0 in 1987 move to the highest level ever of $11.5 billion in 2014 under my watch as central bank governor. It took 27 long years to build back up our stock of foreign exchange reserves to its highest level. And now, our reserves, the lifeblood of our economy, are hemorrhaging. That is why, Madam President, I stand here today. I have a vested interest in what happens to my country. It is my sincere hope, despite politics, those in government can move past pettiness and ego and listen, hear, and take action before it is too late for all of us. Madam President, I've observed the economic policy of this PNM administration is based on fear. It preys on our fear of ending up with our backs against the wall and our noses against the glass of the doors of 719th Street in Washington, D.C. That is the home of the International Monetary Fund. The dreaded IMF, in its first address to our nation on December 10, 2015, Prime Minister Rowley warned, and I quote, "If we fail to adjust now, we will find ourselves as we did in 1986, with an economy with insufficient foreign exchange reserves and having to restructure our debts under a series of IMF programs. This administration will not take this country back to that kind of situation." End of quote. Just over 1 year later, in his address to the nation on January 11, 2017, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Let me end by reaffirming my commitment that this government will do all that it has to be done to keep our country out of the grip of the lender of last resort, the IMF." Under the spotlight on Trinidad and Tobago's financial circumstances held just 1 month ago, the Prime Minister again sought to use one of our country's lowest economic moments to show his government is doing what is best for the country. He said, "In this period of significant decline in foreign exchange inflows, it will be unreasonable and dangerous to use up our foreign exchange reserves as we were accustomed to. This would be paving our way into the arms of the IMF and that is something this government is not prepared to do. Many of our citizens remember the trauma we endured in the late 1980s and early 1990s when we were forced into the arms of the IMF. Many public servants still remember the 10% cut in wages and salaries. Many persons still remember losing their jobs. And some still remember padlocking their homes and taking the keys to the banks because they could not meet their mortgage payments. And many of us in here all remember the exodus of our family and friends who fled, mainly to Canada, because they were looking for a better life. We basically forfeited our national sovereignty to an international institution because successive PNM governments failed in their duty and responsibility to our country. Prime Minister Rowley, early into his administration, has set this ominous economic benchmark of our country returning to the IMF. And I think he preys on our fear of being trapped by the IMF. He's using our traumatic experience as a benchmark for his performance as a prime minister and his government. His strategy? Set the bar so low and use the fear of that low point. So then anything a little higher is considered a win, and you come out looking like a hero. The Prime Minister is using the fear of the IMF to drive support for his flawed economic policies. We have to do this so we don't end up at 719th Street. He's dangling the IMF like the sword of Damocles over our heads. Madam President, I therefore find it extremely ironic that the economic importance of the Prime Minister, his army of economic advisors, and of course, the engineer turned economist, the Minister of Finance, is pushing us even closer into the arms of the IMF, rather than keeping us far away from the IMF dragon. Let me explain why I say so, Madam President. It's uncanny how there are three similarities about our situation today in 2017, which resonate with the late 1980s when our economy went into a tailspin and we ended up at the doors of the IMF. First, there's a new incarnation of the PNM in power. Second, our deteriorating economic conditions resemble those of the late 1980s. And third, we have the strange presence of a trinity of persons who continue to play leading roles in economic policy making. Let me deal with the political situation first. Back in the 1980s, the Chamber's PNM government was simply waiting for a crisis to erupt. They had gotten advice from William Demas, who headed a task force and wrote a report called The Imperatives of Adjustment since 1982. Yet every single recommendation made in the Demas task force report was ignored. And if those recommendations were implemented, this country would have been prepared well beforehand since 1982 for the collapse of the oil market in 1986. And we would not have had to endure 7 consecutive years of severe recession, significant unemployment. The unemployment rate back then went to a peak of 22% as measured. 1 in 4 was out of a job. Food prices skyrocketed, and we had to implement harsh austerity measures. And naturally, a frustrated electorate would eventually vote out the PNM in a landslide defeat in December 1986, bringing in the NAR government, but they would have no choice but to eventually approach the IMF and the World Bank for funding and to help administer the bitter medicine of structural adjustment. Today, our collapsing economy under the Rowley-led PNM government shows up the glaring incompetence of an engineer playing economist, a prime minister who prefers economic geometry to economic strategy. And
Senator Rambarran, just have a seat. Again, I am always reluctant when senators are making their maiden contributions, but there are some words that will not, let's leave it out of this chamber, please, okay?
I'm guided, Madam President. I move on. Madam President, I didn't mind too much when the NR government took away our apples and grapes. But this government is hurling us back into the Flintstone age. This brings me to the second similarity, the economic reality. Back in the 1980s, our official reserves were virtually exhausted within 6 years. There was not a single US dollar available at the central bank. Today, our reserves are hemorrhaging, falling from a peak of $11.5 billion in December 2014 to $8.5 billion as of September of this year. That's the lowest level in a decade. At the present rate of depletion, our reserves are expected to fall to about $3 billion by 2021. Think about that. Within the next 4 years, we will only have US dollars available to pay for 3 months' worth of imports. How could a country survive in that situation? Back in the 1980s, the fiscal accounts had moved from significant surplus into deficits averaging almost 10% of GDP. And it would take 10 years before the government will be able to regain some level of fiscal balance. And even then, that would prove fragile. Today, fiscal deficits have averaged nearly 7% under the PNM government for the first 2 years. And the Minister of Finance is overly optimistic that his fiscal deficit will be about 3% of GDP next year. But strange enough, he hasn't given us a timetable for returning to fiscal balance. So it's likely that this administration will run fiscal deficits for each year of its 5-year term. Madam President, back in the 1980s, our public debt mushroomed from 10% of GDP in 1981 to 56% of GDP by 1988. This meant that we could not service our debt and meet our international obligations. And we had no choice but to eventually undertake what is a most embarrassing situation for any country, to undertake a debt restructuring. And we had to do that under the auspices of what we call the London Club Group of Creditors and the Paris Club Group of Creditors. But the thing is this, we could only undertake that restructuring once we were inside an IMF program. It was not allowed to do it on your own. Today, public debt sustainability is a major issue. Our public debt now stands at over 62% of GDP. And the real question is, this money that has been borrowed in the last 2 years, what has it gotten us? Where are the real returns? Where are the benefits? Or are we simply borrowing just to artificially keep this economy alive? We've already experienced one major casualty of high debt. Both Standard & Poor's and Moody's have downgraded us, and they have warned of further downgrades unless we can stabilize the public debt burden. Madam President, this brings me to the third point on the third similarity, the trinity of economic experts. Back in the late 1980s, there were 3 persons who featured prominently in the negotiations with the IMF and in the actual monitoring of our IMF program. Today, those 3 persons hold senior positions in this administration. The first is Dr. Terence Farrell. He was the Director of Research at the Central Bank, and today he's Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Board. And let me say something. Despite all the negative things that Dr. Farrell has said about me, I still hold deep respect for him because he's the person who recruited me into the Central Bank in 1990 and introduced me to the world of central banking and economic policy making. The second person is Ewart Williams, who was seconded from the IMF to be an advisor to Governor Dimas. And he would, of course, go on to become a governor of the central bank. And today, he's economic advisor to the Minister of Finance. The third and last person in this trinity is Alvin Hilaire, who was then a senior economist in the central bank, and today is the governor of the central bank. Madam President, one would think with such esteemed economic firepower, this government would be firing on all cylinders when it comes to managing our economy. Yet, in 2016, we experienced the sharpest economic contraction in 33 years. Let me repeat that. Last year, our country, under this PNM government, experienced the worst drop in economic performance in more than 3 decades. And I do not expect 2017 to be any different. So it seems that the firepower of this economic trinity seems to be more smoke than fire. Or as the old people say, 3 Borats can't live in one hole. Madam President, let me explain why I think the PNM's economic strategy is not working. And the first reason is obvious. This government is ignoring the advice of its very own economic experts. Dr. Terence Farrell, writing in the Trinidad Express on January 3, 2015, outlined a 7-point economic plan to the then PP government on how to stabilize the economy in the face of falling energy prices. The government began to implement some of those elements of Farrell's plan, but demitted office 2 years ago. The question is, did the incoming Minister of Finance follow the advice of his own Prime Minister's chief economic advisor? Let's look at the record. Dr. Farrell's 7-point plan was as follows. 1, act quickly and decisively and avoid the IMF. Instead, the Minister of Finance has failed to act quickly and decisively, and as I've made the case, we are moving even closer to the IMF. Second, he said, achieve external balance in the shortest possible time. Instead, our official reserves are depleting. Third, and this is extremely important, the stance of fiscal policy must be dictated by the requirement of achieving external balance, not vice versa. Instead, the stance of fiscal policy is based on generating revenue, not protecting our external position. The fourth element, fix the time frame for achieving external balance. This time frame should not be more than 2 years. Instead, 2 years have passed and we've achieved no external balance. His fifth point, the HSF should not be touched. Instead, the HSF has been raided twice so far. Sixth point from Dr. Farrell, monetary policy should cooperate by raising interest rates. Instead, the central bank has kept its policy rate unchanged for the last 2 years. The last interest rate hike by the central bank was done under my watch in December 2014, mere days before I was removed from office. And the 7th point that Dr. Farrell made, wages and incomes policy should cooperate. Instead, the tripartite agreement is in shambles and the trade union movement is ready to rumble. So, if the Minister of Finance continues to ignore the advice of the Prime Minister's chief economic advisor, maybe he's following the advice of his own economic advisor, Ewart Williams. Let's see. Speaking at the Dimas Rambarran seminar series at UWI St. Augustine on November 14, 2013, the minister's own economic advisor offered 6 basic preconditions that must be met for economic diversification in a country like Trinidad and Tobago. First, a macroeconomic policy that ensures economic stability. Instead, the economy is in recession, fiscal deficits are large, public debt is rising, and our reserves are depleting. The second precondition, a high-quality physical infrastructure in roads, power, water, ports, and communications. Instead, our physical infrastructure is suffering with senseless budget cuts and poor implementation of the PSIP. Just look at the recent widespread flooding. Simple example. The third precondition, human quality capital, as reflected in the output of our tertiary education system, complemented by flexible system of training institutions. What do we have? Instead, gate has been cut, and the training institutions have lost their way. Fifth precondition, adequate investment in research and innovation, supported by both the public and private sectors. What do we have instead? Investment in research and innovation is negligible, near less than half of 1% of GDP. Fifth, a business-friendly environment that is attractive to both foreign and local investment. Instead, what do we have now? A plethora of taxes that would now hamper business investment. And finally, an effective, modern, and transparent system of governance. What do we have instead? Many of our important national institutions have come under assault. Just look at the central bank, look at the Integrity Commission, and look at the judiciary. After 2 years in office, this government has not met even one of the 6 basic preconditions for economic diversification put forward by the minister's own economic advisor. Madam President, apart from ignoring the advice of his own economic experts, the Minister of Finance does not have a concrete plan to stabilize our economy. Just look at the confused themes of his budget statements, a wish list of the latest buzzwords. Budget 2016, restoring confidence and rebuilding trust. Let's do this together. Budget 2017, shaping a brighter future, a blueprint for transformation and growth. Budget 2018, changing the paradigm and putting the economy on a sustainable path. There's no economic logic that ties together these 3 successive budget statements. The only constant among these budget statements is the narrative of blame Kamla, of which this country has become tired after 2 years. The PNM has ruled this country for 41 out of the 61 years since general elections were held in September 1956, squandering 3 energy booms in the process. Yet, blame Kamla is the only mantra that we can come up with to the many solutions and ills facing our country. We have no idea what milestones the Minister of Finance has in mind to restore confidence and rebuild trust. What are the milestones to regain fiscal balance, to stabilize public debt, to stop the hemorrhage of official reserves, and to bring the economy back onto a path of growth? Come tomorrow, we don't know where the exchange rate will be. We don't know whether we will have a job. And we don't even know if we'll be faced with another harsh tax. So why did the PNM announce in Budget 2017 it's going to build a blueprint for transformation and growth, and then decide to change the paradigm in this budget? Where is the logic? Where is the economic logic? So the Minister of Finance is ignoring his own experts. He doesn't have a plan. He has not articulated a path to economic stability. What else could he be doing wrong? Well, the minister is implementing his fiscal policies at the wrong speed and in the wrong order. Madam President, what confuses me as an economist is how could the Minister of Finance and his army of economic advisors when they were crafting the PNM's 2015 manifesto, failed to take into consideration the need to properly sequence and pace these economic policies. The Minister of Finance has introduced VAT on food, mixed it with a few dashes of higher fuel prices. He's attempted to introduce the controversial property tax. He plans to tax the life out of the gambling and gaming industry, and he's thrown in an online tax for good measure. What has happened? He's implementing all these taxes with a big bang effect, which means they are working against each other. They are canceling out the intended revenue benefits. It's no surprise. The minister continues to fall short of his revenue targets. But then again, he's short on logic, and his policies are short-sighted. Madam President, the Minister of Finance does not have barakat. Barakat is an Urdu word that many of the old folks use to describe the ability to earn wealth and to keep it. This government continues to show their hands are not blessed to create wealth. The result of not having any barakat is that the minister has shamelessly raided our HSF, our Heritage and Stabilization Fund. And while the conditions exist legally to access the HSF, borrowing from the HSF must be a last resort measure, not a first resort measure. Borrowing must take place only after significant expenditure cuts have been made and after all financing options have been exhausted. This has not happened. This government has drawn down $625 million from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. That's more than 1/10 of the balances in the fund at that time. Think about that for the moment. It took about 4 years for the HSF to build up a balance of $625 million, and this has been consumed in 1 year. And by 2020, when general elections are due, it is quite likely this government could eat up 8 years' worth of savings from the HSF. Talk about having no barakat. And there's a whole question about the government says these drawdowns are going to, from the HSF are going to use to finance the PSIP. But they're deliberately vague about what are these high priority projects that require this financing. The minister should tell the country whether our HSF funds were used to finance completion of the Brian Lara Stadium. What about the Prime Minister's house in Tobago? Will our HSF funds be used to finance the extension of the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway to Manzanilla, a project now mired in controversy? Or will our funds be used for golf courses? Madam President, maybe the minister could redeem himself in the economic management in another area, exchange rate policy, but I doubt very much. He and the new central bank governor are running down the country's reserves. They have unleashed a devaluation genie amongst our people, prompting fears that 10-to-1 is murder in this country. Since this government has assumed office, the TT dollar has lost officially 6.5% of its value. But on many foreign exchange transactions, banks are adding on a service charge that puts the selling rate at $7 to 1. And on the black market, the selling rate is at least $8 to 1. That means we have had a de facto devaluation of our currency by over 25% in 2 years. 25% in 2 years. How can this population adjust to that magnitude? The Minister of Finance when he was wrapping up the budget debate in the other place, talked about expert syndrome. And in his October 2015 budget statement, the minister decided to revert to the old foreign exchange distribution system, and that would clear the backlog. Of course, we have seen that that has not happened. Despite reverting to the old system, and the central bank selling over $3 billion to commercial banks between January 2016 to September of this year, many persons and many businessmen are still complaining about who gets foreign exchange, how much they get, and when they get it. The sales of foreign exchange continue to be concentrated among the bigger business entities, the 1% super elite. And that is why I had made changes to our foreign exchange distribution system, Madam President, so that it could become more accessible and widely available. And those changes were made well in advance of the decline that would come in the commodity supercycle and the fall in global energy prices. It was meant to give the economy a time to adjust. Today, if those changes were made, everyone would have gotten an opportunity to more equitably share in our shrinking national foreign exchange pie. Instead, the super elite 1% business group continues to receive 80% of the US dollars sold by the central bank. And 22 months after my removal as governor, the blame for foreign exchange shortages have moved from blame Jawla to others. Dr. Terence Farrell, when he spoke on September 26 at the Arthur Lockjack, said, the foreign exchange availability issue is a self-inflicted wound by the government. That's your own economic advisor saying that. The Prime Minister, not to be outdone, at the TTMA award ceremony on October 3rd, said, foreign exchange hoarders are now causing the foreign exchange problem. And the Minister of Finance, in his wrapping up on the budget debate in the other place, went on to blame casino owners for leaking foreign exchange out of this country. So, as usual, they have no idea of the source of the problem. How can we solve the problem? Madam President, small island economies like ours require exchange rate stability, not exchange rate uncertainty, which we have now. And there's been a lot of textbook discussions about the need to rapidly depreciate our exchange rate. Any suggestion that we should do that is terribly misguided. Most of what we import cannot be produced locally. We don't manufacture laptops, we don't manufacture mobile phones, we don't manufacture motor vehicles or spare parts. And even if we did, many of these inputs would still need to be imported. Why are we harping on significant depreciation of our currency? And it's strange, Madam President, despite the uproar about foreign exchange shortages, no one has called on a new governor, Alvin Hiller, to explain why we still can't get foreign exchange. It seems it is only the minister who is doing the talking about foreign exchange. Somehow, the new governor is held to an imaginary standard.
Senator Rambarran, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Somehow, the new governor is held to this imaginary higher standard, and that his appointment seems to be more sacred than all the other governors. Yet his appointment has turned out to be the most tainted in the history of the central bank. Alvin Hiller is no sacred cow. Madam President, let me just say a few words about the sale of CLICO assets. The minister is dependent on the sale of these assets to almost close his budget gap. He's looking at $5 billion from the sale of CLICO assets to close the budget deficit this year. This is not a prudent approach. Why do I say that? Because the sale of CLICO assets is now mired in legal issues. The government has placed CL Financial in receivership. CLICO is under legal control of the central bank. CIB is in compulsory liquidation, supervised by the High Court. Ownership and sale of these assets is a legal matter for the courts to decide, not a matter for the Minister of Finance. The courts don't work according to the minister's schedule. And it is quite likely that the budgeted financing of $5 billion that is expected to come from the sale of these assets will be again delayed this year, leading to a larger than budgeted deficit, and that it means the minister would have to borrow an additional $5 billion. Or, again, raid the HSF to finance his deficit. One more point on the sale of CLICO assets. I urge this PNM government to conduct itself in such a manner that it avoids any perception of a fire sale of these assets of CLICO, and that deals are being made to dispose of these assets to a select few. Because it seems this government has a warped sense of what constitutes openness, transparency, and accountability when it comes to the sale of these assets. And as I wrap up, let me ask these 6 questions related to the sale of CLICO assets. Was the January 2017 sale by CLICO of its Buko estate in Tobago, more commonly known as No Man's Land, done in an open, transparent, and accountable manner? No. Did the central bank announce the sale of No Man's Land to the public? No. Was the September 2017 transfer by CLICO of almost 30% of its shares in Angostura to Corporation Seoul done in an open, transparent, and accountable manner? No. Did the central bank announce this transfer of Angostura shares to the public? No. Was the September 2017 transfer by CLICO of around 16% of home construction shares to Corporation Seoul done in an open, transparent, and accountable manner? No. Did the central bank announce this transfer to the public? No. Madam President, let me thank you for allowing me the opportunity to make my contribution to this 2018 budget debate. And I'd like to close with this last point. Just like the electorate called upon the NAR to rescue our economy from the PNM in the late 1980s, so too the political storm clouds are gathering. And the real paradigm shift will soon take place when the electorate will call upon the UNC in 2020 or even before to rescue them from the most incompetent, spiteful, and vindictive incarnation of the PNM yet. I thank you, Madam President.
Honorable Senators, let me congratulate. Honorable Senators, let me congratulate Senator Rambarran on his maiden contribution.